right. So this one is Amazon Neptune serverless is now generally available. So this one is
Finally.
a real case of the devil's in the details, or in this case, the devil's in the the devil is in the details in this one.
Yes. So there are two parts. I mean, two comments that I have. I am glad that the Neptune team has finally released this. This was um, I mean, this was supposed to have been launched at last reInvent, and they just kept running into issue after issue after issue internally, and finally got around to releasing Neptune serverless. But this is not the serverless that you expect. This is literally a set of servers and an auto-scaling group.
Yeah, it is serverless, but there's a floor of 2 servers.
Correct. And this is, I mean, if you wanted to draw parallels, they are basically using the same framework as the Aurora serverless V1. So if you remember Aurora serverless V1 from a couple of years ago, that was basically a very similar setup where it would basically just add new machines to the cluster like an auto-scaling group. It wasn't truly serverless. You didn't have your Aurora compute units like you have today with serverless V2, where it just automatically takes care of your scaling in small increments of your compute units. It literally just added a machine or an instance type that you specified as the baseline instance type. So this is more like the Aurora serverless V1. They finally got it out. I really wish that they just skipped this whole version and gone straight to the serverless V2 framework that they have. But yeah, it's definitely progress.
Well, it's interesting. If you look at the pricing page of Neptune serverless, come up here, Neptune pricing. So you have on-demand instances, right?
Yep.
And then when you go to the serverless part here, you have this Neptune capacity units. But then here, this is what's important. Starting capacity, 2.5 NCUs. So you can scale, but you're never going to have this Neptune database that you don't touch or that you don't pay for unless it's running. Right? It's not like Dynamo where you can just query it whenever
but
you
want.
want.
Even the Aurora serverless is kind of a little different. So Aurora serverless increments in, I think, half ACU or the Aurora compute unit increments, which seems way better. Actually, looks like this one is slightly different from. They've tried to kind of merge some of the V1 and V2 mechanics in this serverless instance. So that definitely seems interesting. I have a little bit of a love-hate relationship with Neptune. Like, I really love the team. I love, all the work that they're putting into it. However, when I look at a competition with something like Neo4j, and I know that they have fundamentally different objectives with their databases and use cases that they've been thinking about. But when you look at the UX and the ease of use of something like Neo4j versus Neptune, I think Neptune is definitely one of the most complex and hardest services to get started with. But anything that they can do to make it easier for customers to get started is absolutely welcome. Scaling has always been one of those things where as you add more data, and the number of nodes and edges just blows up exponentially, because again, it's a graph database, so you want all the connectedness and the richness of the connected data in there. So that the number of edges just blow up like crazy as you start putting in more and more information in there. And scaling it, historically had been, I'm going to shut down this instance, dump all the data, then load all the data, and that takes forever to happen before you can get started with the new data set or a resized instance. So definitely a simplification, I think. But they still have a long way to go.
And to their credit, it's a hard problem. I think graphs are like even they're saying that predicting how to execute a query is a lot harder on a graph, right? Because you don't, with a traditional SQL database, you could see exactly where your indexes are, but you can kind of throw any query at a graph, and where it's going to go is I think it's a lot harder to predict.
Um, I wouldn't think it's that much harder or that much different. Fundamentally, I think with this framework that AWS has adopted, where they separate out storage and compute, where storage basically operates within an S3 like setup, it's kind of distributed across multiple, um, you know, multiple storage units under the hood, and compute basically can act independently on that particular storage is a paradigm that they've repeated in Neptune as well. And you would basically take an Aurora index and replace that with a Neptune index, which tells you where the nodes are, where the um, your relationships or your properties are. Now, if it was RDF, I think it gets a little easier, because if you're storing data in RDF format, it's literally a three tuple. So in a three tuple, it's much easier to kind of think of it as a flat file with three tuples. You can index it on your first item in the tuple if you wanted to, or the relationship, or the last. So I think that would be a little easier. But even property graphs aren't that much harder. You would typically have a similar data structure that you could index and get to. Like, of course, you don't want to be indexing the attribute unless explicitly asked for in the property graph, but not an unsolvable problem or a difficult one. I think the parallels with Aurora are really, really, really strong.
That's a really neat way of thinking about it. And I guess to close this segment, I want to post an anonymized version of a comment that was in our internal chat. I thought this was interesting. That at least Aurora Serverless V2 scales close to zero. An idle Aurora Serverless V2 costs very slightly less than an Aurora on-demand T4G.medium. So increasing your spend 4x over the smallest provision instance type isn't the best advert for Neptune Serverless. So I think that summarizes it fairly well, and that it's good to have, but it's not serverless in the tradition in the scale to zero sense that we'd want it to be,
or in scale to near zero. I think near zero is acceptable, but yeah, this doesn't do that.
All right, so we've rated this a simplifies. What about the how many clouds out of 5?
I'd give it a 3.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think this article suffers from the bias that we have, or I have, with wanting Neptune to do more. It's a really cool service with a cool paradigm of, it's a graph data stores are amazing for a bunch of different use cases, and you want to use more and more of it. You wish it was natively supported. Like, one of my biggest graphs is, why can't Neptune have something like a sandbox, which you can kind of spin up? Here's your dump. You can spin up a Neptune instance operator with a few queries and then shut it down.
Well, and a simple UI like Neo4j, where you can sort of play with the nodes and edges and get a real feel for it.
Exactly. And instead, it's a behemoth. Like, any operation on these Neptune databases, like, unless you have like a billion records that you want to kind of put in a graph and understand and traverse for some big financial fraud, it would be a hard case to make for someone to switch over to Neptune. Like, that's my takeaway from Neptune. I love the product. I love the team. The team is pretty awesome. But yeah,
I'm with you on graph database. I love graph databases. I had a lot of fun earlier in my career playing with graph databases in the context of cancer research and loading up these clinical pathways and being able to compare them and compare patients and do patient similarity. It was a blast. So I hope that this technology continues to mature and Amazon can make it even more accessible.